Hello and welcome to The World's Inside Our Woods. This is a panel session brought to you as part of SussexSpringWatch, which is an 8-week programme of activities for the whole community. It encompasses kids' activity packs for Easter, a wonderful arts competition, lots of snackable content on social media, and also this really interesting panel conversation, which I hope you'll enjoy. My name's Jane, and I've been asked by the local community group here in West Sussex, stoptheclaypit.org, to host and moderate this event, which brings 3 really interesting panelists to talk around a topic that's all very dear to our hearts. If you're interested in finding out more about the action group, then do head over to their website, which is www.stoptheclaypit.org. Just a few housekeeping tips before we begin. You'll notice that we're recording this session and all of the audience is on mute. But don't worry, there's plenty of opportunity for you to talk to the panelists yourself today and ask them some questions. Just use the chat function to do that, and we'll pick that up in a Q&A session towards the end of today. And I hope you'll find the topics of interest and want to do that. So let me introduce you to our panelists who've kindly given up their time to join us. You may know some of them, as some of them are local. So let me firstly introduce Dr Tony Whitbread. Tony's a very familiar face in West Sussex, as he was the former Chief Executive of Sussex Wildlife Trust. He's now President of the Trust and continues to be an active spokesperson on ecological things. So welcome, Tony.
Hello, everybody. Good to be here.
And our second panellist also joins us from West Sussex and is another doctor, and that's Dr Jill Sutcliffe, who's an environmental scientist. Jill's varied career has taken her all over the UK, where she's advised government bodies and charities on a wide number of issues, as far afield as Cornwall, and also more locally, where she helped to form the Manhood Wildlife and Heritage Centre in 1997, which in 2010 was awarded the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service. Well done, Jill, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
And from a little further afield, up in the Northern Hills near the Prespa Lakes, is Julian Hoffman, a writer who joins us because he's so passionate about all things conservation. You may have discovered his blog, which is called the Notes from Near and Far. It's a really interesting one, and I encourage you to seek it out. Or perhaps you may have read his beautiful book, Irreplaceable, which last year was highly commended by the Wainwright Prize. And we're delighted to have you with us, Julian.
Thank you ever so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So thanks all of you for joining us to talk about a topic that I know you're all really passionate about, and that's the world inside our woods. And we're going to discover a little bit more about the woodland communities, the beautiful springtime that we're looking at the moment. And for me, certainly, I'm lucky enough to live near the woodland. And when I go for a walk now, I'm seeing the leaves coming into bud. There's lots of bird song. There's primroses in full bloom everywhere. There seems to be a lot going on. But I'm wondering what magic is making that happen in springtime, and what's happening perhaps beneath the surface, under the soil, through the canopy. Dr Tony, you've mentioned the Wood Wide Web to me before. Let's explore that a little bit and uncover a bit more about the woodland.
Yes, certainly. Well, woodlands, yes, they're not more than just a kind of random mixture of trees. There's more to them than that. And I think it's probably exemplified by the phrase you've just used, the Wood Wide Web. You know, we know about the trees, we may know about the ground flora, but we rarely think about what's going on under the ground. And that's absolutely incredible, because what's actually happening there's probably more life under the ground than there is above ground. And the Wood Wide Web is a kind of useful phrase for the way that fungi interconnect in the soil underneath all the trees. Now, if we think about that, it's an incredibly complex and diverse and actually quite huge system. I saw some statistics one day of if you look at a gram of soil, just one spoonful of soil, there can be 50 kilometres of fungal hyphae, that's fungal threads, in 1 gram of soil. That's about the distance from Lockwood to Chichester and back again, wrapped up in a gram of soil. It's absolutely incredible. Vast number of species all working away there. So a great deal of is going on. But it's not just kind of sitting there. It is the ecological engine that's driving the whole of the ecology there. So doing all the digesting of minerals and so on, and they're actually making all those minerals available for the trees. So if your Wood Wide Web is in a bad state, your trees do very badly as well. But we've recently found out there's all sorts of other things going on. Trees chemically interact with each other through this fungal network. They actually talk, in inverted commas, to each other through this fungal network. If one tree gets sick, somehow a message that gets passed to another tree to say, hang on, there's a virus on the way, or there's a fungus on the way, or something. So they actually pass some sort of resistance or resilience onto neighbouring trees. And it goes the other way as well. So some organisms actually make use of that to actually parasitise trees. There's all this going on here, which is absolutely incredible. There's more life under the soil than there is above it, which is incredible. And we think about trees, we think about, it's really quite important these days, because we think about carbon and locking up carbon. We look at those trees, vast amount of standing crop of carbon there, which is great. That's absolutely correct. But what we often don't realise is that actually 75% of the carbon in forests is in the soil. Only 25% is actually what you're looking at. So I just thought I'd explain that or paint a picture of that, because I think it really ingrains that what we're looking at when we're looking at woodland is more than just even what you can see. It's more than just trees. It's more than just a lot of trees that happen to be living together. It is a whole living system that delivers all sorts of wonderful benefits. I mean, this time of year, you mentioned it, you just go into the woods, you see the way changes happen, the spring unfolds. Now we're seeing the wild daffodils at the moment. A little bit later on, we'll be seeing the bluebells, maybe the wood anemones, all sorts of other things we'll be talking about a bit later on. I thought that the Wood Wide Web was a nice way of kind of, illustrating how this is a whole living system.
Absolutely.
That's a lovely thought, Tony. I was thinking as well, though, when people go out into the woods, if they've got access to a stethoscope, they can put it up against the tree and hear that sap rising. So that what's going on under the soil is getting into the tree and up to the top of the tree. And then you'll see the leaves coming out. And of course, when the leaves come out, that casts shade onto the woodland floor. And before that happens, you get the spring flowers coming out while there's still some light. So those changes are going on. It's like cycles going on all the time.
Yeah. And of course, one of the fascinating things I think about the whole Wood Wide Web in many ways is how recent a discovery it is for humans. The first really teasing out, of some of these mysteries wasn't until the late 1990s, really. And it was a Canadian ecologist called Suzanne Simard who really started understanding that beneath that surface, there was this complex set of relationships. And I think in the first paper she'd written about it, she'd said that, we have the fungi and we have the trees' roots, but it's through their duality that they forge a kind of oneness. And that then becomes the forest. And I think what is so astonishing for me is that only 20 odd years ago, this discovery has kind of it's enlarged our whole understanding and perspective of what a forest is. What does a forest mean? What does a woodland, how does it live? How does it interact? And of course, we're now understanding each day ever further that it's really a composite engine of life, that it works through collaboration and cooperation and symbiosis and mutualism. And that we're really, really just, as it were, skimming the surface right now of these extraordinary complex interrelationships that keep those woodlands in place.
Oh, it's absolutely true. And I remember when I was back in college, which was a little while ago now, I have to admit, but the idea of these are called mycorrhizal fungi, the fungi that interact with the roots of the trees, they're called mycorrhizae. And the idea of mycorrhizae was a kind of weird thing that one or two plants we thought might do. Now we realise it's completely everywhere. A lot of plants simply couldn't function without not only fungus in general, but the right fungi at the right time. And it's quite interesting when I see in some places woods are being planted in apparently the ideal conditions, and trees aren't doing very well. Sometimes it's a bit, well, why is that? And the likelihood is that because of our past treatment of the land, the mycorrhizae that are associated with trees, or maybe the fungi in general, have actually been going down and down and down and disappearing in these areas. So even if the physical conditions seem exactly right for some trees, plant them, they may actually not do very well because they haven't got all these associates that they actually require.
That's fascinating. I've definitely learned some things there that I didn't know about. It just struck me that, here we are sending off spaceships to Mars, but there's so much more we can discover on our own planet, much, much closer to home. And Jill, I love that idea of the children in the Easter holidays going in the wood with a stethoscope and hearing the sap rise. Just extraordinary. What a wonderful thing to do. But it also sounds as though, from what you've all said, there's so much happening in the web, in the Wood Wide Web. There must also be additional communities as well. You touched on fungi there, Dr. Tony, but what about bugs? What about worms? What about invertebrates? Should we maybe explore the ecological community and perhaps talk to some of the plants that we might see coming up over spring as well?
Well, yes, and this is woodlands are my favourite habitat. It's where I probably feel most comfortable. As Jill knows, we've known each other for a long time. Get me out into a wood and I'm happy as Larry. But actually, it's great because you can go into a wood and you can read it like a book. You can actually, the way you identify a plant, you don't go by the individual characteristics. After a while, you just know the plant. Well, it's a bit like that with wood. You can actually say, well, this is that sort of wood. And if you go into our Sussex Wealden woods, they're of a particular type, which is fantastic. And you can build a picture. So trees you get, oak, hornbeam over the shrubs, hazel, for example. Maybe you'll get some chestnut in the canopy. That's a particular sort of woodland. And you look in the ground flora, what's growing below it. And again, it says about the community that you're in. You get bluebells, you get wood anemones, you maybe get some town-hall clock and things like that. And they all start to explain, well, what sort of place is this? And in the Sussex Weald, it explains a sort of physical condition that's very familiar to all of us, and that is spring waterlogged clay soils. And if anybody lives in Sussex, we know about spring waterlogged clay soils every time we try and walk along a footpath, because that's actually what it's like. So here we have spring waterlogged clay soils with low amounts of lime in the soil, so it's not like being on the downs. And that's the sort of woodland community you get. And it has this flavour of a bluebell, wood anemone, maybe under oak and hornbeam, maybe with some chestnut, hazel's usually there. That's the sort of picture you can build up. So immediately it builds a picture in your mind, not only of a collection of plants and animals, but actually of a community you can actually identify and realise that you're within. And actually in Sussex, that's the main woodland type on our Sussex Weald. It changes when you go up into Ashdown Forest, where it's more sandy. It changes when you go onto the downs, where it's more chalky. But this kind of nice clay-soiled woodland is what we get in Sussex.
I think farmers and gardeners are well aware of the clay soil, as well as us who go out into the woods, because it makes it so difficult to dig and to keep things growing. And the lime or the chalk that comes down off the downs helps ease that considerably. But you didn't mention oak in your description of what trees might be there. And of course, the oak is known, there's two types of oak, the English oak and the peduncular oak. One has different acorns at different times, and the leaves are slightly different. But the point is, an oak can support something in the region of 350 different types of insects. So if you've got an oak there, you've got a lot of other things around it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
there's that wonderful line by Oliver Rackham, isn't there, about how a 400-year-old oak can support countless species that 10,200-year-olds cannot support at all. And of course, once you start talking about communities, you get into this discussion about habitat niches as well. And there are, something like 650 British beetle species that rely almost exclusively on veteran trees or on ancient woodland. That is their dwelling ground. That is the habitat and home that they require. And, this opens up a large discussion, of what woods mean, when we talk about creating new woodlands, about, planting saplings, because of course, it's also those mature woodlands and older woods that are of vital importance, because we can't recreate the necessary niches and conditions that are really vital to support that huge range of species that you just mentioned there, Jill.
I do find it worrying that people seem to think you can take all these old trees out and it doesn't matter, or you can put in some new ones and that will equal it up. Well, it doesn't work like that. If a tree's been established over a long time as part of a community, it's built up all sorts of other relationships which don't exist by just planting new trees.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I used to give talks on ancient woodland, I used to say, recreating an ancient woodland is about the same as trying to give birth to an old age pensioner. You don't automatically have all that wisdom of age just because you've kind of tried to recreate it. It just doesn't work. You don't get the associations, you don't get the fungi, you don't get those soil organisms working together. Many of the plants we get in ancient woodlands are very slow to colonise. Most of the ones I've already mentioned, they're slow to colonise. They're indicators of ancient woodland. You just don't get them in new woods. If you do, they're just occasional. So you can't just run up a new one when you run down an old one. It's something that has to take a long time to develop. And actually, another aspect which you haven't mentioned yet is the link to human history as well. We have all this natural history, the way ecology works, but it's completely intricately linked to the human history of that area. woods are always far more complex than you think they are. You can go in there and you can look at the past history by what's there. And it has links, for example, to the way industry used to work in the Weald of Sussex. Woods are so common in Sussex because wood products were used for so many things. You have links with the iron industry, with the glass making industry, with the tile industry, all those sorts of things. So you have that history written in the woods. Randomly planting the occasional tree in a field does not replace that.
And is it worth just exploring for one moment? Because I'm listening to what you're all saying there, and there's a very strong message coming out around how having something there for longevity creates a completely different community, a different environment. Presumably, it's also creating a food web as well. So if you introduce new species, they're never going to be able to support the breadth of invertebrates and bugs and everything else that a more established community would do. Should we just talk for a few moments around the food web and if there's more to explore in that area? Perhaps something for the children to be looking for when they're wandering in the woods during Easter.
During Easter, it is still worth looking at the ground, because the things like nuts will have fallen to the ground and still be there on the ground. And if you look very closely, you can often find marks of what's been nibbling them. Things like mice or voles, and they nibble in different ways. The squirrels may take them away and bury them, and other birds do that as well, and sometimes they forget where they've put them. But there are worth looking up, picking up, and also shapes of leaves, picking them up off the ground and having a look at them and seeing if you can work out which type of tree it is.
Absolutely, and an interesting thing about the woods that we visited around Loxwood there is that I actually found it was not the species of oak tree that I expected. The oak tree that's common in Sussex is the pedunculate oak, so that's otherwise known as the English oak. But when we went into the woods at Loxwood, we found they were the sessile oak, which is normally a tree that's found in the north and the west. And it wasn't just one or two trees; it was a lot of them. There's something special about these sorts of woodland, and it may be linked the way the trees were used in the past. And I've got a suspicion that the sessile oak was more usually used in the tanning industry, when the bark was taken off to tan leather. That tended to be oak coppice rather than trees, and it tended to be the sessile oak that was coppiced. So you may have something that's a bit unusual in Loxwood there, which links in with the leather tanning industry, and the sessile oak as coppice.
Great, how interesting. Wouldn't it be great to explore that and uncover a little bit more? Just now, Tony, you were touching on connections and really the connection between humans using the woodland and the woodland community itself. And that's certainly something we've seen a great deal more in the past year during lockdown. It is very muddy here in Sussex. Those pathways have been even muddier than normal because of the amount of people getting out and enjoying the space in all sorts of different ways. I saw an article that David Attenborough had written where he said, just go and sit on a tree trunk for 10 minutes and listen to the woodland. And literally the next day, there was a young man sitting in the wood on a fallen tree, just exploring and listening to the woodland. It was wonderful to see. So let's maybe just drill down a little further into those interconnections. Perhaps thinking about human well-being and eco-cultural dimensions, history, the pandemic, and what a lifeline the woodlands have been for us. And Julian, I know that's an area you're really passionate about. Would you maybe like to kick us off?
Yeah, of course. I think the first thing that we begin to recognize when you're starting to talk about the Wood Wide Web, when you begin talking about these complex ecologies and communities that exist in and around woodlands, is that woods are compound places. They are patterned and they are interwoven and they are made up of so many varied components. And that's as equally true of the human attachment and connections as it is to, let's say, the wildlife connections and the ecological processes that underpin them. And certainly when you begin talking about mature woodlands or ancient woodlands, there's often a historic dimension that's really, really critical to kind of take note of. And it's sometimes things that I think a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, because many older woods were once working woods and they would have looked profoundly different. They would have smelt different. They would have looked different. Everything about them would have been different to the woodlands that you get to experience today in 2021. And those woods would have been filled with the coppice cutters, and there would have been the tanners, and there would have been bark strippers, and there would have been besom makers and barrel makers and coopers, and all of these complex, livelihoods that depended upon, for hundreds of years, depended on the richness and diversity and quality of British woodlands. And of course, it was the protection of woodlands for those livelihoods and those crafts that meant that they persevered into the future. But what's really important to note, I think, is that while very, very few of those livelihoods are still with us, or if they are, they tend to be, rather small affairs, human connections to woods are still as deeply rooted as ever. They've simply altered their forms of expression. And, whilst I was writing and researching Irreplaceable, I had some extraordinarily moving conversations with people in various parts of Britain about what their woodlands meant to them today. And that depth of feeling was really extraordinary to me, because I think I was very, very well aware of how frequently people use them to go jogging or a bit of bird watching. Or, to take the dog for a walk. But, I met people who would harvest beech leaves and they dip them in glycerine and they use them to decorate wedding cakes. Other people use them for kids to identify leaves, and, some sought solace there after they'd been widowed, and others sought them because they were places where they could find some sort of mental equilibrium for themselves. So they are places of mystery and wonder and beauty and joy. And although our uses of them have changed, our connections haven't. And I think as we slowly begin emerging out of a pandemic that has, brought a great deal of compression to our lives and stresses, I think we would probably all acknowledge that woodlands have been one of the key pivot points internally in many ways. The ability to spend time in them, ability to let go of certain things, just to immerse yourself in them, is crucial importance. And so for me, these woodlands, they're the living embodiment, not only of our histories and our cultural past and livelihoods and complex ecological processes, but they are radically alive to our needs today and into the future too.
I think that's really lovely to hear. And I also feel that woodlands ask nothing from you, but give you so much. And that's really quite unique, isn't it? Whatever the weather is like, just to hear the birds singing, the leaves rustling, it just offers so much solace and support and just contentment to different people.
It is amazing, isn't it? There are a lot of people I know who'd never really shown interest in wildlife or nature or joined the Sussex Wildlife Trust, and they all heard the bird song in lockdown, and they all have taken a much more active interest and aim their walks to take in places like woodlands. So the pandemic has had very constraints on lots of people's lives, but we've also learnt a lot about what we value and how important being outside and wildlife is. I would.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just saying, it's interesting, isn't it? Because yes, for a long time the woods were valued in terms of their products, pure and simple. Today, I think actually that's broadening in spectrum. Now we're regularly enumerating the value of woods in terms of the other practical benefits they can provide: carbon storage, building up soil. They can actually help with obviously nutrient recycling, but also flood risk reduction and all sorts of things like that. Now, if you add that up, that can be a massive amount of real economic benefit, which is far greater than actually the timber provided. But I would say even that is superficial. The really important thing is actually the much more in-depth, intrinsic value of woodlands that we all get simply by being there. We shouldn't have to justify the existence of a wood by its kind of pounds, shillings and pence value to us. Important though that may be, they're far more valuable in the way they actually touch us far more deeply. We'd simply go mad if there weren't any woods around. I couldn't exist. I don't know about anybody else.
Tony, I think that's obvious.
And I guess really quite pointed when it comes to why we're doing this session today, which is brought to us by a local group of community who feel very strongly about protecting woodland that they've enjoyed for a number of years and really want to see it protected for the future rather than potentially become part of a commercial development which could change the face of it forever. So maybe let's just pause there and think about that for a moment, because I've heard various different things during this very interesting conversation, certainly, as I said earlier, things that I wasn't aware of before. But it strikes me that if change were to happen within a woodland, it would have impact upon the biodiversity. Can we explore that a little and just consider what the impacts might be if any form of development happened within woodlands that contain margins of ancient woodland, veteran trees, and well-established habitats.
Shall I start by saying that change happens in woodlands all the time? They are actually quite robust ecosystems, and we shouldn't see them as static in terms of unchanging. They are dynamic, changing places, but they're dynamic within reasonable bounds. You can do a lot, actually. You often benefit woodland a lot. You can receive a lot. You can get a lot of benefit out of this within a fairly broad spectrum. You go outside of that, and you start to lose all those benefits. In fact, it's almost like falling off a cliff. You know, you can do all sorts of things, and the wood may even get better. As soon as you push it too far, it falls off a cliff, and you start to lose things really quite badly. You lose individual things, obviously, but you lose all those interconnections. And if you lose all those interconnections, you lose you're not so much in touch with history. You're not so much in touch with the kind of real communities that make up that area. So, yes, I mean, you start to lose all the meaning of woodlands. I mean, Julian mentioned Oliver Rackham a while ago. He's one of the world's greatest ecologists, and he wrote fantastic books about the meaning you can get by just reading a woodland. You would lose all that. You'd end up with a place with a couple of trees in it because somebody put them there. And that doesn't have much meaning. You lose all that meaning. You certainly lose all the services that we get in practical terms, and we also lose all that intrinsic value. So you lose a lot by impacting on woodlands too much, but I don't want to give the impression that it has to be preserved in aspect and never change. They are dynamic, changing things within reasonable boundaries.
But also at their own rate, Tony. One of the difficulties is that we've now found that biodiversity is being reduced at such a rate that we've had to declare an emergency. People may be very familiar with the climate emergency, but the biodiversity emergency is just as important because we could lose up to 1 million species. That's what the assessment of the issue by the International Panel decided, that we're losing it at a rate much quicker than the species themselves can replace themselves. So we have to take care of what we've got, because if we take it away, there's no way it can come back.
Yeah, we're losing. Okay, we're losing species at roughly 100,000 times faster than the background rate, which is frightening. And scientists have estimated that it'll take 3 million years to recover from the extinctions that we've already had. And here we are in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. So we can't treat this superficially. Sorry, I interrupted you, Julian.
That's okay. I just wanted to say something that, a few years ago, I had a very interesting evening I spent with a professor of ecology called Ian Rotherham out of Sheffield. And we went up to the Peak District and this glorious early summer evening light. And his speciality is ghost woods, or lost woods, as he sometimes called them. And, you could see that it was a landscape up on the moors that was heavily grazed by sheep. And then on the other side of a stone wall was a field. And this field was bordered by just a couple of very, very small trees. But the center of this field was full of bluebells, the most luminous bluebells I'd ever seen. But the reason they were so luminous is because there were no longer any trees shaded above them. And so what I learned from him is that these traces of a past landscape, so the bluebells lingered on despite the wood, but everything else about the wood was gone. And it was a real, quite haunting, beautiful in many respects, but ultimately extraordinarily haunting of what is lost, and lost so frequently. And while some species might linger on, the vast majority of them won't. And it was the bluebell that kind of brought my awareness to the fact that, landscapes are frequently littered with these ghosts, these relics, these sort of species that should be there, but they aren't. They should be surrounded by whole communities, but instead they stand as the sentinel survivors of a landscape that has changed dramatically.
A friend came to visit me, who's an invertebrate insect specialist, and he arrived and he said, "I've counted 19 orchards missing since I left home." His eyes were geared to, because orchards can have special insects in them, to what was missing in the landscape. And I think you do become able to not only read the landscape, but to appreciate what's missing.
Mm.
And we can see this in our own landscape in Sussex as well. I mean, the idea of woodland ghosts is a fascinating thing. If you look at the hedgerows, and we call them shaws in Sussex, the thick belts of trees, generally speaking, relics like that you'd expect to be fairly species poor because there's not much there. But you can go into some in Sussex and you find things are incredibly rich. Now, why is that? You've got almost like a thin strip of ancient woodland, which is now a hedgerow. And you look at the map and you realise what you're looking at is the edge of what was a wood, where the rest of the wood has gone, and you've now got the strip around the edge that was left. Hollowed out, it's a woodland ghost. Sometimes you've even got the wriggly shape of the original wood left behind, whereas the wood in the middle is gone. It's a real woodland ghost. So yeah, as Julian said, it's a fantastic example of something remaining, but just imagine what was lost. That can actually be a source of colonisation for bringing a limited range back again. But actually, that's part of the reason why we have such a complex history in our ecology in Sussex.
So let me play devil's advocate for a moment, and don't shoot me down for asking you this. But if woodlands can sustain change, if we can still continue to enjoy bluebells where there once used to be trees, and if, as the owner's agent, I believe, has claimed in one of the webinars, they intend to end up with a net biodiversity gain, does it really matter if they chop a few trees down?
Well, chopping a few trees
coming towards me, but let's explore that for a moment.
Yeah, chopping a few trees down is, I mean, that's how you manage a woodland, but it depends how you frame it. But actually, as we were talking about, the whole community is there. And actually, the species that you get in woodlands took a long time to get there. Ancient woodlands date back at least 400 years, possibly to the Ice Age. Many of those species simply wouldn't recolonize. They're gone. Now, you could get what you could call it net biodiversity gain by introducing lots of other easy to introduce species, but you'll have lost all the sensitive things. You'll end up with a flora and a fauna which is just the same as any fairly ordinary piece of recreated woodland anywhere, instead of having something which really speaks to what it's like to be in Sussex. So you'll be losing the sensitive and the rare and the stuff that takes a long time to colonise, the stuff that's actually working best in its own environment, and you're gaining something which is incredibly common. You may lose orchids, but you'll gain stinging nettles. You know, you may lose dormice, but you'll gain rabbits. I mean, if you just play a numbers game, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So, yes, weed communities that tend to colonise these damaged places have a lot of species in them, but they're the species that colonise very easily. They're the species that are common, the species that are always there, often the species that you really wish weren't there. So you're replacing one rich, diverse, complex, and sensitive community with something which may be species rich, but it's full of all the easy colonists, the common and the common colonists, basically.
I think following up from Tony's excellent points there, you know, this idea that we can exchange one woodland for another one that might have been in existence for successive centuries and has developed or accumulated these compound ecologies. The example I like to give is that in the Las Vegas casino several years ago, and hotel and casino complex, was shown a replica of King Tutankhamun's tomb, which had been recreated using period materials, period methods. But we all know that when you go there, that's not the original. It might look fantastic and it might be of interest, but we all know that the original is the irreplaceable artifact itself. So you can't simply swap something in, however good it might look, and say that it's the same, because what you remove is the underlying essence, and that essence is absolutely what's responsible for it is the succession, is the continuity of interplay between people and species and soil and climate and livelihood. All of those things are ultimately extraordinarily irreplaceable because we have no way to recreate the conditions under which those woods first came into an existence and were maintained over successive generations.
There was a lovely television programme which showed an oak tree, an acorn, being planted 1,000 years ago. And then it tracked the changes in the communities and the people involved with looking after the woods, with how the tree grew and what was happening to it. And it gave that real link between how communities were making use of their woods and the growth and development of the trees. Worth catching if anyone's got a catch up for a very old oak tree.
And maybe we'll try to think of an Instagram, Jill, and let everybody know what it is.
Sorry?
Maybe we'll find that programme and let everybody know what it is a little bit later on. That would be good. So you're all incredibly passionate about the woodlands. You all speak to them with such knowledge, and it certainly helps me to understand more about what's potentially going on out there, and to feel like it's a really great topic to explore. As we're just coming up on the time now, let's maybe close this first part of the session by asking each of you just to share a few thoughts around the woodlands, what makes them important to you, and anything further you'd like to add before we move into the Q&A.
Right, should I kick off? Just a few thoughts. I mean, get back to the big picture stuff. Here we are in the Sussex Weald, which is about the most well-wooded part of Britain. So
it's second. It's second.
It's second. It's second.
Surrey comes out top.
Yeah, it's second to Surrey, but Surrey doesn't have nice woodlands. They're degraded heathland. So that's another story.
I stand corrected.
Apologies to everyone from Surrey. Yeah, so we have a large concentration of woodlands in Sussex. So isn't that fantastic? About 18% of our land is woodland of one sort, and about half of that is ancient. So that sounds great, doesn't it? But let's look at the bigger picture. The average for Europe is something between 30 and 40%. I think it's about 35, 36%. That's the average for Europe. So the maximum in this country where we live is about half the average for Europe. When it comes to biodiversity, we rate 189th down the list out of 219. We are one of the most nature-deprived countries in the world. We're against this background. We can slap ourselves on the back and say, isn't it wonderful we got all this, that and the other? And wouldn't it not matter if we lost a bit? But the truth is very different. We're a long way down the league table. Things are getting worse. We have we have the least well-wooded landscape, more or less, in Europe. Yet we're still trying to eat away at some more. I'm saying this isn't the sort of thing we should be doing. We should be looking entirely differently at our whole landscape and look at a regenerative approach. We shouldn't be having to defend places. We should be talking about regeneration. We should be talking about expansion, bringing back habitat, rediscovering our natural capital, rebuilding the things that have been lost. We shouldn't be talking about whether or not we lose some more.
I agree, Tony. I'm very pleased to see that other people in the community also care and want to ensure that their woodland is looked after because they enjoy it and they value it. I'm very proud. I live alongside an ancient woodland and I'm a commoner. That's not quite what you might think it means, but from the days where the land was communally shared and people didn't have private ownership, the woods were administered collectively. And although the government tried and did change the law in 1968, they still left room for local people. So there's 22 of us are commoners for our ancient woodland. And we're the eyes and ears on the ground if anything is being done that's detrimental to our ancient woodland. And then I'm straight on to the Sussex Wildlife Trust manager.
And I would probably just wrap up, I suppose, by saying that we owe everything to those people in the past who preserved and protected those woodlands that we enjoy today. And consequently, it's our responsibility, and I would also argue it's our ethical responsibility, our moral duty to ensure that those woodlands stay with us, but for the use of future generations as well. And, I think there's also a lesson to be learned from what we began this entire conversation with, which is the wood wide web and that extraordinary relationship between fungi and the roots of trees. We now know categorically that trees do not exist in isolation. We do know that fungi does not live in isolation. It works and it thrives because of mutualism and cooperation and collaboration. And it's imperative that we live in relationship with woodlands in the same way, that we work through cooperation and collaboration and recognize kinship, because without woods, we will always be far less than we could possibly be.
Thank you. What a lovely comment to end on. I think we all share your sentiment there, Julian. So thank you so much to all of you for taking the time to join that discussion and take it through so interestingly. Just to remind everyone, you do have an opportunity now to ask questions of our panelists. So if you've not yet sent anything through, please do. We're just going to pause for a moment and then we will move on to the Q&A.